For 6 long years, he waited behind cold, unyielding metal bars, watching as one by one, the others left. Puppies with bright eyes and wagging tails found homes. Older dogs, timid and unsure, were chosen too, but not him. People walked past him as if he were invisible. Volunteers wept for him, but their tears couldn't set him free. He had become a ghost in a place meant for second chances, until the day everything changed, until the day someone did the unthinkable. And what happened next will break your heart in the most beautiful way. His name was Shadow. He had arrived at the shelter as a young German shepherd, full of life, sharp-eyed and strong. That was 2,380 days ago. Now he was 8 years old, his once dark muzzle dusted with gray. Yet every morning as the staff made their rounds, unlocking kennels, cleaning floors, filling food bowls, Shadow did the same thing. He stood up. He walked to the front. He sat down, tall, ears perked, waiting for someone to stop, waiting for someone to look past the gray, waiting for someone to see the dog he still was beneath the weight of time and iron bars. No one ever did. The volunteers adored him. He was gentle. He never barked when people passed. He let children pet him through the bars without flinching. He was patient when the other dogs barked and growled around him. He never pushed forward, never begged. But week after week, year after year, he was overlooked. Too big, too old, too serious. The labels stuck, and so did he. Then, one day, a new volunteer noticed him. Her name was Emily. She was 27, had been coming to the shelter for 2 months, and yet somehow she had never really seen Shadow, until now. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't jump or pace or bark. He just sat, back straight, eyes calm, watching. There was something haunting about it. Not because he looked broken, but because he looked like he had stopped believing anyone would ever choose him. That afternoon, Emily turned to the shelter coordinator. "Maggie, why is he still here?" Maggie sighed. "Shadow's an old soul. Came in after his owner died in a fire. No chip, no relatives. He's healthy. He's sweet. But what? No one wants the dog who's waited the longest. People think there must be something wrong with him." Emily looked back at the kennel. Shadow was sitting there, quiet, still, dignified, alone. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those eyes, not desperate, just tired. She picked up her phone and typed, "This is Shadow. He's been in a shelter for 6 years, never had a single adoption, never even a trial. Please share his story." She hit post. Then she went to bed, expecting nothing. By morning, the post had been shared over 2,000 times. By noon, 20,000. By nightfall, national news outlets were calling the shelter. But no one could have predicted who saw that post next, or what they would say. Because what happened next didn't just bring tears. It changed everything. The next morning, the shelter was buzzing. Phones rang. Emails flooded in. Volunteers whispered as they passed Shadow's kennel, some smiling, some hiding tears. The post had gone viral. Over 50,000 shares in under 24 hours. Adoption offers poured in from across the country, even from Canada. But it wasn't the sheer number of offers that stunned everyone. It was one message in particular. Emily stood in the office, her hands trembling as she held her phone. She read the message aloud, her voice unsteady. "I think that's my dog. His name was Max. I've been looking for him for years. Please tell me it's really him." Daniel Rivers. Maggie narrowed her eyes. "Do you think it's real?" Emily turned the phone toward her. He attached pictures. They scrolled through images taken 8 years ago. A younger Shadow running through the snow, lying on a living room rug, sitting beside a man with kind eyes and a short beard. Same ears, same white patch under the chin, same steady, unwavering gaze. Maggie's breath caught. "It's him," she whispered. Emily swallowed hard. What do we do? Maggie's answer was immediate. We get him here. Fast. 2 days later, the shelter parking lot was silent until a silver SUV pulled in. And then, everything changed. Daniel stepped out of the SUV, his flannel shirt slightly rumpled, his eyes glassy before he even reached the door. For 6 years, he had searched. 6 years of dead ends, unanswered questions, and a hope so fragile he barely dared to hold on to it. The fire had destroyed everything, his home, his past, his sense of safety. He had spent months in the hospital, recovering from injuries that had nearly taken his life, and when he was finally released, Max was gone. The shelter that had taken him in had shut down, the records lost. No one could tell him where his dog had gone. He had tried, he had looked. But eventually, he had been forced to accept the unthinkable. Max was gone. Until now. Until he saw a photo in Emily's post, and something inside him collapsed. The face, the eyes, the way the dog sat. He knew. Maggie led Daniel down the quiet hallway toward Shadow's kennel. Inside, the old shepherd lay on a padded blanket, his head resting over his front paws. He had long since stopped hoping for anything. But then, footsteps. His ears twitched. He lifted his head. And then, he froze. No one moved. Emily stood at a distance, barely breathing. Daniel stepped closer, kneeling just outside the kennel bars. His voice was barely a whisper. Max? The dog blinked, tilted his head. The name rippled through him like a memory breaking free, something buried beneath 6 years of silence. And then, without hesitation, he stood up, walked to the gate, sat down, just like always. But this time, he wasn't looking through a stranger. He was looking at the man he had never stopped waiting for. Daniel reached through the bars, his hand trembling as he touched the side of Max's face. The dog didn't flinch. He leaned in, slow and steady, and then, from deep in his throat, a sound escaped, a soft, shaky whimper. His tail thumped against the floor, once, twice, then faster. Maggie turned away, wiping her eyes. Emily pressed her hands over her mouth, frozen. Daniel's voice broke. I thought you were gone. Max nudged his nose into Daniel's chest, breathing him in, recognizing him, recognizing what 6 years hadn't erased. Home. That afternoon, the adoption papers were signed. No waiting period, no questions, not this time. Everyone in the shelter lined up to say goodbye. Staff, volunteers, even adopters who had followed the story online and showed up just to witness this moment. Shadow, Max, walked proudly beside Daniel, tail wagging, steps sure. As they reached the exit, Max paused. He turned, looking back down the hallway where he had waited for 2,380 days. Then, with quiet certainty, he turned forward and walked out. Into the sunlight, into freedom, into everything he thought he had lost. But what neither of them knew was that Max's story wasn't over, because once he was finally home, he would do something that would leave Daniel, Emily, and everyone who followed his journey absolutely speechless. The first few days were quiet. Daniel's home, a small, cozy rental on the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, was nothing extravagant. A fireplace, a couch, a few framed photos of a life that had once been full, then torn apart. But now, it was full again, full of paws padding softly across wooden floors, full of the rhythmic sound of water lapping in a bowl, full of quiet sighs before sleep. Max had claimed the living room rug within minutes, as if it had always been his. And maybe, in some way, it had been. Daniel couldn't stop watching him. Not in an obsessive way, just in awe. The way Max moved, the way he scanned the room before lying down, the way he followed Daniel step for step, as if making sure this wasn't just a dream. At night, Daniel would sometimes wake to find Max curled beside the bed, eyes open, breathing slow, as if he were guarding something, or someone. Then, one morning, everything changed. After a long walk by the creek, Daniel made a decision. For the first time since the fire, he would go back to the place he had lost everything, back to the cabin. Max sat in the back seat of the SUV, calm but alert. As they drove, Daniel noticed a shift. The ears perked higher, the gaze sharpened. The closer they got, the more Max seemed to sense it. The memories were heavy. When they arrived, Daniel stepped out and inhaled slowly. The ruins were barely visible now, just blackened boards, moss covering the past. The land was quiet, peaceful. Then Max stopped. He stood still, eyes locked on something at the edge of the trees. Daniel followed his gaze. "Max?" he said softly. The dog didn't move. He was watching. And then he took off. Not in panic, in purpose. Daniel's heart pounded. "Max!" He ran after him, pushing through brambles, branches clawing at his clothes. Max knew where he was going. He led them down the slope, through the brush toward a narrow clearing by the creek. Then he stopped, ears twitching, listening, and Daniel heard it too. A sound that made his breath catch, a sound he never expected. Crying, he pushed through the last of the brush, and what he saw would change everything. Max had visited schools, shelters, hospitals. He had stood beside children in courtrooms, sat patiently next to kids learning to read for the first time, comforted veterans struggling to find their way back. He never barked, never begged for attention. He just showed up. And in his quiet presence, he spoke the loudest truth. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are still needed. But there was still one place left to visit, the place where he had waited, and waited, and waited. Daniel pulled into the shelter parking lot late one afternoon, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Max sat beside him in the passenger seat, watching the building with calm, knowing eyes. It looked smaller than Daniel remembered. The same brick walls, the same sign above the door, though the paint had started to fade. The place that had been Max's home for 6 years. Maggie was waiting by the entrance, smiling as they stepped inside. The moment they walked through the doors, everything felt different. Staff and volunteers gathered in the lobby, whispering, watching as Max padded forward, his tail low but wagging, his nose sniffing the air like he was remembering something long buried. Then, without hesitation, Max turned and walked straight down the hallway. No one stopped him. No one called him back. Daniel followed silently, his heart in his throat, past the front desk, past the break room, past the rows of kennels where dogs now stared out, watching him. Then he stopped. The old corner kennel, the last one on the left. Max stepped inside. Daniel's breath caught. The blanket was different. The water bowl new, but the space, it was the same. 6 years. 6 years behind these bars. 6 years of waiting. Max stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. Then, slowly, he turned, walking back to Daniel's side, looking up at him with eyes that had seen so much, that had endured so much. And then, he wagged his tail. Just once. As if to say, I am not the same dog who waited here. I am not waiting anymore. Daniel knelt beside him, ran a hand down his back. You did it, buddy, he whispered. And as they walked out of the shelter, this time, for good, Daniel knew Max had left something behind. Not just an empty kennel, but a space for someone new. Because the world is full of souls like Max, the ones waiting, the ones overlooked, the ones who just need someone to believe in them. And maybe, just maybe, Max's story would help them find their way home. Now he was returning, not as a shelter dog, but as a symbol of hope. The first light of dawn painted the sky as Daniel pulled into the shelter's parking lot, the same lot he had walked across all those years ago, heart-pounding, unsure if Shadow, now Max, would even remember him. That day had felt like the closing of a painful chapter. Today felt like the start of something far greater. Emily was already waiting by the front door, wearing her well-worn volunteer shirt, the fabric faded from years of washes. Her old name tag, Emily K., volunteer since 2020, gleamed in the soft morning light. The moment Daniel stepped out of the truck, Max leaped down gracefully. His body moved with the confidence of a dog who finally knew who he was. Not a cage number, not unadoptable, not forgotten. He was Max, and he was home. But not to stay. This time, he had a mission. The shelter itself hadn't changed much. Same gray walls, same faint scent of bleach and fur, same row of kennels stretching down the hallway like a tunnel of second chances. But the people inside, they were different. When they saw Max walk through the front doors, something shifted. Tails wagged in unison from behind kennel bars, a ripple of excitement passing through the shelter. The dogs waiting inside, those still longing for a family, seemed to sense what his presence meant. Max was proof that the wait could end. Maggie, the shelter coordinator, stepped out of her office, a clipboard in one hand, a tissue in the other. Her voice wavered as she laughed through her tears. "I knew this would break me," she whispered, kneeling. Max walked straight to her, pressing his forehead against hers as she whispered, "You did it, boy. You made them all believe." They had prepared something special. Emily led Max and Daniel to the end of the hallway where his old kennel had once been. In its place was a glass panel display. Above it, a plaque read, "Shadow, now Max." He waited 6 years, and then changed lives forever. Inside the display were photos. Max behind the bars, in the news, with Abby at the schools, with Daniel, and at the center, his original ID tag, Cage AS12. Emily reached into her backpack, pulling out a brand new tag. This one read, Ambassador Max, from shelter dog to hope giver. Daniel fastened it gently to Max's collar. Max wagged his tail once, then sat beside the display, calm, still, just as he had so many times before. Only now, the people walking past weren't strangers ignoring him. They were visitors stopping to read about him. They were children kneeling to wave. They were new adopters asking if they could meet the dog who had waited. And Max didn't flinch. He let them come. He let them touch. He let them cry. Because he understood. This place was no longer a prison. It was a beginning. And he was its proof. Later that day, something happened that no one expected. As Emily gave a small speech in front of the staff and visitors, Max stood up. He left Daniel's side and walked to one of the kennels. Inside was a shy, scared-looking pit bull mix named Benny, a dog who had been returned twice. Max sat down outside the kennel. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just waited. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, Benny crept forward. He lifted his paw and placed it on the gate, the same way Max had once done for Emily. The shelter coordinator wiped her eyes. "I think he just picked the next one," she whispered. By sunset, Max was back in the truck, head resting on the armrest between the seats. Daniel glanced over and whispered, "You ready to go?" Max closed his eyes. His tail tapped once. A soft, yes. That night, Emily posted a photo of Max sitting in front of his display. The caption read, "He came back to show them it's possible. Max doesn't live in a kennel anymore. He lives in hearts." Within 48 hours, the post reached over 1 million people. Donations poured in, more adoptions followed, and dogs who had been waiting for months or even years finally went home, because one dog had waited longer, where you began to heal. But before that could happen, Max had one final journey to make, one last chapter to close. The place where he was born, the place where his story had almost ended before it ever truly began. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Daniel opened the drawer and pulled out the old manila envelope. The edges were worn, corners bent from years of being moved but never opened. Inside was a printout he had avoided for nearly a decade, the fire report. One address was circled in red, 781 Franklin Hill. The cabin that burned, the place he once called home, the place where Max was born, the place where he was lost, and now, the place they would return to. They drove in silence for over an hour, the road winding into the hills before narrowing into a gravel path swallowed by overgrowth. Daniel hadn't been back since the fire. What was once his sanctuary had become nothing more than a scar on the map. Max stood in the back seat, nose pressed to the cracked window, tail still, body alert, almost as if he knew. When they reached the gate, Daniel stepped out and started up the old path. Max followed, slower now, ears flicking in every direction, tail low, but not tucked. The cabin was gone. In its place, a clearing. Some of the old foundation stones still remained, and the blackened chimney stood crooked in the earth like a broken tooth. The air smelled of pine, moss, and old ash. Daniel crouched, pressing his hand against the ground. "I thought you died here," he whispered. Max didn't move. He just sat beside him, silent, steady. Then he stood and walked. Daniel followed as Max made his way toward the edge of the clearing. He sniffed, paused, then turned sharply toward a thicket of trees. And there, hidden beneath the overgrowth, was something neither of them expected. The old training shed, still standing. The roof was partially caved in, the door barely hanging on its last hinge. Inside, Daniel had once kept food bins, toys, training cones, Max's first collar. He pulled the door open slowly. The scent of smoke and decay rushed out, thick with memories. But beneath the mess, Max moved with purpose. He sniffed his way to the far corner, then stopped. Something was there. Half buried under a charred plastic bin, a small melted remnant of the past. A red ball, worn, barely intact. Daniel picked it up gently. Max wagged his tail once, then nudged the ball with his nose before lying down beside it. It was more than just an object. It was a memory, a confirmation, a closing loop. Daniel sat beside him, placing the ball between them. "You survived this," he whispered, "and you became more than I ever imagined." Max rolled onto his side, pressing against Daniel's leg, and let out a deep sigh, the kind only a dog can release when a part of their soul finally exhales. The next day, Daniel and Emily filed the paperwork to officially purchase the land. Not to rebuild the cabin, not to make a home, but for something bigger. They would call it Max's Field, a private, peaceful sanctuary, where older and long-term shelter dogs could be free, even if they never found a family. Because Max had taught them something no shelter ever could. Sometimes, the place you're meant to be isn't behind a fence, it's in the space between where you were broken and where you began to heal. In the weeks that followed, Max's story spread like wildfire. Volunteers signed up to help clear the land, builders stepped forward to donate fencing, and children wrote heartfelt letters to Max, thanking him for saving Abby, for waiting 6 long years, for proving to the world that even the forgotten could become unforgettable. And then, one evening, just before the first foundation stone for Max's Field was laid, Daniel sat in the grass beside him. "You ready to let others rest where you once broke?" he asked softly. Max leaned his head against Daniel's lap, exhaled deeply, and closed his eyes. Yes. But there was still one final chapter left to write. One last visit. Not for Max, but for someone who had never stopped loving him. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, just a postmark from Vermont and a shaky handwritten label. To whoever has Max. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and an old photograph, A puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, licking peanut butter from a little girl's cheek. Daniel sat on the porch, reading the letter slowly. His name was Bear when I had him. My dad surprised me with him on my 10th birthday. We were best friends for 2 years. Then my parents split. We lost the house. I lost Bear. I've looked for him ever since. When I saw him on the news, I knew it was him. I don't need him back. I just needed to know he's okay. Thank you for giving him the life I couldn't. Monsieur Daniel blinked away tears and looked over at Max, curled up in the grass, watching birds flicker across the sky. People don't just remember you, he said aloud. They carry you. More letters followed, from shelter volunteers, from former staff, from a man who had almost adopted Max 3 years earlier, but had never forgiven himself for walking away. From Abby's mother, who now took Abby to a local rescue every Saturday to read books to the dogs. Each letter had one thing in common. Max had changed something in someone. Forever. Then, one day, Emily arrived at Daniel's home carrying a box. "What's that?" he asked. She placed it on the porch table and opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound book, a photo of Max on the cover. The Dog Who Waited by Emily and Max, a self-published children's book. 30 pages, simple drawings, simple words, a powerful message. Sometimes the dog you pass by is the one who will save your life someday. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly. Then he closed the book and hugged her tightly. That weekend, Max made his final public appearance at the opening ceremony for Max's Field. Children ran through the grass. Older shelter dogs stretched out in the shade of the trees. A plaque was unveiled. Max waited 6 years. Now, no dog will ever wait alone again. Max sat beside the stone, still, peaceful, whole. That night, back home, Daniel sat on the floor beside him. "Can I tell you something?" he whispered. Max lifted his head. "I thought I was rescuing you," Daniel smiled. "But you were rescuing me all along." 3 weeks later, Max passed away. No pain, no fear, just a breath in, a breath out, and a life that had given more than it ever took. But his story didn't end there. Max's field grew. Emily's book found its way into classrooms across the country. The shelter's adoption rate tripled. And Daniel? Every morning he still sat on the porch, not in grief, but in gratitude. Because Max had taught the world something beautiful. You are never too old, never too broken, never too forgotten, to become someone's hero. If Max's story touched your heart, remember, every shelter dog is waiting for a moment like his. You can be the one who gives it to them. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Together, let's make sure no dog waits forever.